This is the Compass Podcast, finding the divine in the everyday, and that includes looking for the spiritual and theological connections to things happening in the news. My name is Ryan Dunn, and maybe you're like me in that you've been following the developments that really heated up in October of 2023 regarding the Israel and Gaza conflict. This is a long-running conflict representing a lot of pain and human suffering for so many reasons. And the witness of the whole thing is a reminder, I think, that violence is a symptom of our human brokenness and prolongs our suffering rather than relieving it, because so much of this conflict has seen attempts to prevail through violent coercion. And it's because of that violent promulgation that I found it so surprising that so many people claiming the name of Christian have been so enthusiastically supportive of military action in the conflict. So I began to do some research, and the more I surfed around, really the stranger things got. Really, I was taken aback by the number of people who have jumped to the conclusion that this latest conflict is a sign of the end times. And even beyond that, I was taken aback by the number of people of faith who declare that Israel must be supported at all costs. In this case, the modern day state of Israel must be supported at all costs. So in this episode, I want to share what I've found in this research. And the question for me was, why do so many Christians seem to be so blindly invested in supporting the modern day state of Israel? And I want to unpack that question a bit because I want to separate this Israeli state from the Jewish people, because I'm not convinced that the same blind support is there for the larger context of Judaism. The support is specific to the nation state of Israel. I also want to be clear that I'm not interested in proclaiming a right side and a wrong side in this conflict. The use of aggressive violence perpetuates harm and widens the gap between the adversaries. Violence does not lead to the establishment of peace. So that's my soapbox on that matter. What I'm really interested in getting to the bottom of is this religiously driven blind support of Israeli militancy. We're going to dive into some theological history. We're going to talk about big terms like eschatology, and with that, Christian end times beliefs. All that stuff is wrapped up in why some American Christians declare Israel must be supported no matter what. In order to get into all that, though, we probably need to start with the actual roots of the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has now flared into the conflict between the state of Israel and the Hamas group operating out of Gaza. So let's go back to the 1940s. I mean, there's certainly a lot more history prior to that, but for our purposes, we can start here. By the end of World War II in 1945, the Zionist movement, which is an advocating for a Jewish homeland in what had become known as Palestine, that's the Levant, that area at the end of the Mediterranean Sea, eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, this Zionist movement had gained a lot of momentum, and Jewish immigration to the region had increased. And this, of course, was in part fueled by the horrors of the Holocaust. Meanwhile, the Arab majority opposed the establishment of a Jewish state and sought their own independence. The British government at this time held a mandate over Palestine, and they were struggling to maintain order and address the conflict and the demands of the Jewish and Arab populations. In 1947, just exhausted by the tensions and the violence in the area, the British government referred the matter to the United Nations, asking for a solution to the ongoing conflict. And the UN came up with a plan to partition the area known as Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem being placed under international administration. The Jewish state would receive about 56% of the territory, despite Jews making up about 1/3 of the population and owning, at that time, less than 10% of the land. Now, the Jewish leaders accepted this partition plan, seeing it as a pretty good opportunity to establish a Jewish state. And of course, it sounded like things were kind of favorable for them. However, understandably, the Arab leaders were a little bit more resistant, both in Palestine and in the surrounding countries. So they rejected the plan, opposing any partition and opposing the establishment of a Jewish state. It's a fictional account that I'm referring to here, but in The Source by James Michener, there's this account of the days leading up to the British leaving the area and the UN partition plan being put into place. And the two sides, the Arab side and the Jewish side, are lining up to go at each other almost like it's a football play. I mean, there's this sense that like they're jockeying into position, they're trying to read each other's formations and respond to that. And the British leaving is going to be the snap of the ball. And then these two sides are going to clash together and commence tearing each other into shreds. And in reality, that's not far off from what happened. On May 14th, 1948, the State of Israel was created, and that sparked the First Arab-Israeli War. The war ended in 1949 with Israel's victory, but at that time, about 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, and the territory was divided into three parts now: the State of Israel, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Gaza Strip. As part of the UN's plan, again, Jerusalem was supposed to be under international administration, but that never happened. Following the 1948 war, Jerusalem itself was partitioned into a portion controlled by Israel and then another controlled by Jordan. And tensions, of course, remained high for the next 18 to 19 years. In June of 1967, Israel now preemptively attacked Egyptian and Syrian air forces, responding to what they deemed were provocative maneuvers by Egypt. And this started what they call the 6-Day War. After the war, Israel gained control over the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt. They took control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and they took control of the Golan Heights from Syria. Now controlling all of Jerusalem, Israel declared that the city would be its eternal and indivisible capital. This move has not been recognized internationally. Most other countries recognize Tel Aviv as the Israeli capital, except that in a move to appease American evangelicals, and we'll talk in a bit on why this is important to them, the Trump administration of the United States moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem in 2017. Now, jumping back to 1973, there was another war between Israel and its neighbors, this one initiated by Egypt and Syria. The October War, or sometimes called the Yom Kippur War, lasted for just a couple weeks. It resulted in Egypt being able to negotiate the return of some of the land that Israel had occupied in the 6-Day War. In 1979, representatives from Egypt and Syria signed the Camp David Accords. This is a peace treaty that ended the 30-year conflict between Egypt and Israel. And that kind of resulted in peace for Israel internationally, somewhat, at least officially. But there were still a lot of troubles within, and within groups that still wanted to see the end of Israel. So promises for self-governance for Palestinian Arabs had never been fulfilled. People were still being displaced to make room for Israeli settlements, so conflict continued within. In 1987, thousands of Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip rose up against the Israeli government in what is known as the First Intifada. The 1993 Oslo I Accords mediated the conflict, and that set up a framework for the Palestinians to govern themselves in the West Bank and Gaza and enabled mutual recognition between this newly established Palestinian Authority and Israel's government. In 1995, there came about the Oslo II Accords that expanded on the first agreement. It added provisions that mandated the complete withdrawal of Israel from 6 cities and 450 towns in the West Bank. A second intifada began in 2000, this time sparked by Israel's continued control of the West Bank. This resulted in harsher measures being taken by Israeli authorities, and of course, more resentment ensued. Meanwhile, a militant group called Hamas won control of the Palestinian Authority's parliament. Hamas was internationally considered a terrorist organization. As part of its charter, Hamas calls for the destruction of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic society in historic Palestine. Now, Hamas's ascendancy caused a rift in the Palestinian Authority, and the group was overthrown in some parts controlled by the Palestinian Authority, but it retained control in Gaza. Now, since then, Hamas has fired rockets and mortars into Israel since the group took over the Gaza Strip in the mid-2000s. And early in the morning of October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched several thousand rockets into southern and central Israel, hitting cities as far north as Tel Aviv. Hamas militants also breached the heavily fortified Gaza border and infiltrated many southern Israeli towns and villages, killing hundreds of Israeli troops and civilians and wounding and kidnapping scores more. Hamas's military leader, Mohammed Daif, said the group undertook its assault because of Israel's long-running blockade of Gaza, its occupation of Palestinian lands, and its alleged crimes against Muslims. The Israeli government then responded by declaring war against Hamas and prepared to carry out what it called a complete siege of Gaza. Since then, the two sides have traded daily rocket fire, and Israel has ordered more than 1 million Palestinian civilians in northern Gaza to evacuate ahead of a possible ground assault. Meanwhile, Gaza is running out of water, fuel, and supplies amid an Israeli aid blockade, and the conflict risks spreading to a cross-border kind of situation as strikes escalate in Lebanon and Syria. Okay, so that's the picture in the area painted with some very, very broad brushstrokes. It's awful, right? It's also a long way from the United States. It involves actors who are of different religions. So the question remains, why are so many American or Western Christians so passionate about the security of Israel, and why do they care where the Israeli capital is? And why do they see recent events in 2023, those that I've just really detailed, as a possible sign that the end times are upon us and that Christ is returning? Let's get into it. Okay, some Christians interpret certain passages in the Bible, particularly in the books of Daniel, Ezekiel, and Revelation, as prophesying events that they believe will occur in the end times, a period they associate with the return of Jesus Christ and the final judgment. These interpretations are often grouped under the term eschatology, which is the part of theology concerned with things like death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul, and the final destiny of all of creation and all of humankind. The idea that a war between Israel and its neighbors, or between Israel and internal combatants, that this war is a sign of the end times, is rooted in these eschatological beliefs. And it is particularly associated with dispensationalist and premillennialist interpretations of the Bible. We're going to get into definitions for those terms. Many dispensationalist and premillennialist Christians believe that the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy and a key sign that the end times are near. They often point to passages in books, again, like Ezekiel and Daniel, that describe conflicts involving Israel and surrounding nations in the end times. So let's talk about these theological groupings, dispensationalism and premillennialism. If you're popular with the Left Behind series from the late 1990s or early 2000s and the subsequent movies, like we had one set that had Kirk Cameron, Nick Cage was in a Left Behind movie, then you've gotten a peek into dispensationalism. The basic ideas go something like this. The history of creation can be broken, or the history of the universe can be broken into several distinct epochs or dispensations. Each of them represents a different way in which God relates to humanity. Now, different schools of thought exist around how many dispensations there have been and how many there will be, and then even how to characterize these dispensations. But here's a summation of one popular line of thinking. The first dispensation was the age of innocence. This was before the fall of Adam and Eve. The next one was the age of conscience. This was the period from Adam to the great flood and Noah. Then came the dispensation of human government. This was from Noah to Abraham. Then came the period of promise. This was from Abraham to Moses. Then the dispensation of law from Moses to Jesus. Then came grace from Jesus to the future rapture. And then comes the millennium, which is a future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. The nation state of Israel has become wrapped up in the idea of this final dispensation, the millennium. Dispensationalists hold to a very literal interpretation of the Bible, especially around prophetic passages concerning the end times and the nation of Israel. And here we need to note that a core ideology behind dispensationalism is that there are two peoples of God. Israel is one, and Israel consists of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the other, grouping of people of God is the church, the Christian church, and it consists of all those and only those, whether they are Jew or Gentile, who are saved between the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came to the believers and followers of Jesus, and the beginning of the end times. Crucial to the dispensationalist reading of biblical prophecy, drawing principally from Daniel and Revelation, but also to some degree from Ezekiel, is the assertion that the Jewish temple will be rebuilt on the Temple Mount as a precursor to the Lord or Jesus returning to restore the earthly kingdom of Israel centered on Jerusalem. Therefore, the dispensationalist movement was stoked up by the reestablishment of the state of Israel in 1948, because this is the precursor of them then being able to reestablish the temple in Jerusalem. It has grown in popularity, particularly since 1967, coinciding with the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War. And a few years later, in 1970, with the publication of a book by Hal Lindsey entitled The Late Great Planet Earth. Dispensationalism teaches that the second coming of Jesus Christ will be a physical event, by which a worldwide kingdom, earthly kingdom, will be established in human history, and it will be geographically centered in Jerusalem. The second coming happens as two key steps are completed. In the first step, Christ returns to resurrect the chosen, saved, or blessed dead, and also to rapture the living believers from the earth. Now, let's take another little sidebar for a moment and talk about the rapture. Again, definitions depend upon whom you ask, but generally speaking, the rapture is predicted to be an instant where the faithful are sucked into the air and away from the earth. In a sense, they're raised to heaven and taken from earth. And the idea finds its genesis in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, which says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, and the archangels call, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord." In essence, the faithful are taken away from the earth so that they can escape the tribulations that are to come. After this rapture, a 7-year period of hardship and tribulation occurs. There will be famine and wars and the rise of the Antichrist, and all of this climaxes in the epic battle of Armageddon, during which Christ intervenes and establishes a literal 1,000-year millennial kingdom on earth. As such, some dispensationalists are often associated with the circulation of end times prophecy, which professes to read omens of the second coming in current events, which is what they're looking at right now. Again, as you can decipher from the blurb about the rapture, dispensationalists hold a very literal view of the Bible. Since it says people will be raised into the air in 1 Thessalonians, dispensationalists believe people will actually go meet Jesus in the air. And dispensationalists take this literal view to prophecies within the Bible. They believe that the numerous prophecies in the Old Testament regarding the restoration of Israel and the Jewish people to their land are to be fulfilled literally, and many are still yet to happen. Again, we need to note that dispensationalists hold to a view that Israel is a group of people separate from the faithful. So to them, the protection of the nation of Israel is necessary in order to usher in the new millennium. When the prophecies to restored Israel are then fulfilled, Jesus returns. You got that? I want to note that dispensationalism is not a theological vein that has always been a part of the Christian tradition. Despite its popularity, it's actually a relatively new idea, first appearing in the 1800s. A man named John Nelson Darby introduced the idea that history is divided into these distinct dispensations during which God deals with humanity in different ways. And Darby lived from 1800 to 1882. Cyrus Scofield picked up on the idea and in 1909 included it in the Scofield Reference Bible, which became widely used among evangelical Christians. The Dallas Theological Seminary leaned into dispensationalist theology, and as its influence spread, so then did dispensationalism. I mentioned another theological concept being central to an end times fascination with Israel, and that being premillennialism. This is simply the aforementioned idea that the second coming will occur before a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ from Jerusalem upon the earth. Dispensationalists are premillennialists, but not all premillennialists are dispensationalists. You got that? In the end, this theological stream places a heavy emphasis on the state of Israel because its supporters see Israel's existence as the fulfillment of prophecy, and therefore, support of Israel is support of the will of God. It's probably obvious that personally I'm skeptical of dispensationalism. I'll go on to admit that I'm skeptical of premillennialism as well. I bring this up to note that there's a wide range of belief across Christianity about the end times and even stances on Israel. I don't really foresee a rapture happening. What I will say I have in common with the millennialists, however, is an expectation that at some point God's full, wonderful vision for creation will be enacted. Though, again, there are some disagreements about what that is actually going to look like. I can't affirm, though, that God's aims will be accomplished through violence and war. But I will offer that I'll agree with the premillennialists on another idea. We need an intervention of peace. Remember, the premillennialists say that Jesus will intervene in the final battle of Armageddon and usher in the new millennium. I'll agree. We need this intervention. I totally believe that the presence of Christ is one of peace and mercy. And I think actually this represents a calling for the faithful. It isn't really a calling to support a nation state at all costs. Instead, it's to entertain ideas of how we each represent a presence of reconciliation, mercy, healing, and peace, even into situations marred by harm and misunderstanding. And when we see that witness, that one that is marked by this mercy and reconciliation and peace, when we see that witness, that's where we're seeing the movement of God, even in the midst of a nasty situation. Okay, that's a wrap on a bit of an offshoot episode of Compass. It's a lot less heavy on the personal story and a lot more heavy on the information and history, but I needed to understand what was happening here, and I thought you might benefit from hearing some perspective on the situation as well. Let's keep co-host Michelle Maldonado in mind as she is traveling for work and then comes home to have some medical treatment done. On behalf of Michelle, I want to share some good news that our episode about the Moral Monday movement in Nashville won an award from the United Methodist Association of Communicators. Great to feel that love. And you can join in the love train by posting a rating or review on your podcast listening platform of choice. I think Apple Podcasts is a great one and certainly makes the rating and review process pretty easy. So click on over there, and doing that helps our exposure on the podcast a little bit. Thank you to United Methodist Communications for their support as well. Episode notes and links are up on umc.org/compass. And as part of this episode and the notes herein for this episode, I'll include links to pages where I pulled a lot of the information and research from. Again, that's on umc.org/compass. You might find that stuff helpful. We'll be back with a fresh episode in 2 weeks. In the meantime, peace to you.